correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you got the first shout-out at the end of President Trump's speech yesterday. Is that right?
I don't know about that.
I think you did.
He's passionate about energy, that's for sure.
And there was a lot of it in his speech. He sketched out this sort of big kind of divergence between American and European energy policy. Why is that such a problem? Why is it a problem if America goes its way and Europe sticks to the green transition?
Because we think that the world is becoming less secure, more concerns abroad, and the strength militarily and economically and industrially of Europe and the United States are both important. The stronger the pro-freedom democracies are, the safer the world is. And the divergence is it's not subtle. Mm-hmm. And green maybe is the justification, but I would say maybe not the reality. If you go back to right after the financial crisis, 2010, the United States was 25% of global consumption. European Union was 25% of global consumption. Today, that's 28% and 18%. And we've seen a pretty large-scale deindustrialization of Germany, of the United Kingdom, of Europe as a whole. And obviously an overdependence on Russia. But that deindustrialization, I think, is a problem as well. We've had a bit of that in the United States as well. But that is a trajectory we think has been very unfortunate, both for our economies, but for our national security. We have an overdependence on Asian supply chains as well. Not that we shouldn't have trade, but wholesale moving of industry in the name of climate policies, I think, has been highly destructive.
And so that's Europe. I mean, obviously, China is on its own version of a green transition too. Do you have any problems with it, or is your kind of focus predominantly on Europe?
It is that term. I have no problems with green transition. I worked in solar energy in graduate school, board member of an environmental group until I took the new position. In fact, I'm passionate about what used to be green issues: clean air, clean water, clean land. But China will bring on somewhere between 50 and 70 gigawatts of coal this year. Mm-hmm. So to call China green, I mean, look, wind, solar, and batteries, $10 trillion in, 2.6% of global primary energy. Hydrocarbons were 84% of primary energy in 1973, and they're about 83% today. So even the term energy transition, I think, is just not consistent with the facts. We've seen a transition of where the money goes. We do spend more money, over $1 trillion a year globally, on, quote unquote, they call them zero carbon, I call them lower carbon energy sources. So huge amount of money is spent there, but it hasn't meaningfully changed the global energy system except for the price of that energy and where that energy is produced. If you shut down a modern natural gas-powered factory in the UK or in Germany, and that product is produced at a coal-fired power plant in Asia and loaded on a diesel-powered ship and shipped back, I wouldn't call that green or energy transition. I just call it a movement of industry.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what specifically in Europe is causing you consternation? What sort of policies are problematic from your point of view?
Well, I mean, in the short term, right? To me, the longer term was this belief that if we put up more windmills and solar panels and batteries and build more transmission lines, we're going to transition the energy system. The United Kingdom, your home country, gets 75% of its energy from just two sources: oil and natural gas. Same in Europe as a whole. It's increased its dependence on oil and natural gas while producing less of them. It's really just moved coal out, but I think at huge societal cost. So in the short term right now, this CS-triple-D regulation, these methane regs, CBAM, that are making it harder and riskier for businesses from the U.S. to bring energy into Europe. One of our goals after the Russian invasion of Ukraine was, and I think European goals, I'd say common goal, to displace the dependence on Russian energy, on Russian coal, Russian oil, Russian natural gas. Natural gas is the trickier one because it takes big infrastructure to move it. But the United States has filled most of that displacement of Russian LNG with American LNG. But going forward, that's at risk. These CS-triple-D regulations, where you're essentially regulating a business's activities all around the world, just if you want to bring a product into Europe, that's not good for Europe, that's not good for business, that's not good for energy affordability or energy security.
So the idea is that the sort of red tape burden in Europe is actually affecting how these businesses operate for energy they produce for America, for Asia. There's a kind of regulatory floor, if you like, and Europe is setting it.
Yeah, if Europe deems their behaviors in hiring and their climate policies, and I wrote a whole book on climate policies and energy policies, but if they deem those unworthy, they can levy huge fines. So what that means to an American business is if those regulations are not meaningfully reformed, it's not worth it for them to send the energy into Europe. It won't hurt American energy businesses that much. That energy will just go somewhere else. But that will hurt the ties between the U.S. and EU, and ultimately, if they're not reformed, the other major natural gas suppliers aren't going to bring gas to Europe either. I believe that'll be fixed, but that uncertainty, that cloud over it right now, I'd say is not helpful.
So I was going to ask, do you have any leverage to try and make it get fixed, or are you kind of just happy to kind of ship your LNG to a different customer if they can't get their house in order?
I am a passionate Europhile, from the Renaissance and culture, the start of science, which is my passion, and the Enlightenment, the birth of capitalism, as we discussed earlier. United States and myself, we're children of Europe. So we maybe have an inordinate passion about the health and well-being of Europe. But I think the risk is greater here. But I have some optimism. I mean, I think in our dialogues with European regulators, everyone understands the issue and I think practically wants to fix it. It's not fixed yet, but I think there's strong will on both sides to make it, we can have easier flow of trade.
So you've obviously done a lot of deregulation in the US. But recently, Harold Hamm, a big supporter of the president, I'm sure you know him very well, he said that the economics of drilling in North Dakota just weren't there anymore, and he was, shipping off. So what more can you do to keep people like Mr. Hamm kind of in business?
Yeah, well, this goes to Adam Smith, right? If you're in a business, and I was a businessman my whole life until a year or so ago, higher prices are good for you. And if you're a consumer, lower prices are good for you. 100% of Americans, in fact, almost 100% of the citizens of the world are consumers of oil and gas, and only about 1% produce it all. So it's a bigger win to have lower energy prices than higher, but ultimately a marketplace drives that. I would say it's the innovations in the shale revolution. Harold has certainly been one of the leaders in that have just continued to drive down the price at which oil and natural gas can be produced, even more dramatically in natural gas than in oil. But President Trump sort of pro-supply, we're going to remove barriers to supply. Biden administration was all into, as he said in the campaign trail, end fossil fuels. I should note 82% of U.S. primary energy production when he was inaugurated, and 82% of U.S. primary energy consumption, not production, consumption when he left office. So he didn't do too well in ending fossil fuels. But if you have policies that make it harder to produce them, you don't reduce the demand for them except through the price mechanism. You make them more expensive. When President Biden was in, we had record profitability ever in the oil and gas industry. Didn't change the demand for oil and gas. He made it harder to produce. You get a little bit less, you get higher prices. President Trump is the exact opposite policy. He's all in allowing the production, not subsidizing it, allowing the production of energy of all forms. Go at it. Let's grow supply. Ultimately, that'll drive down prices. That'll benefit consumers and make it more challenging for businesses. But businesses innovate. They move forward. They survive. Harold's going to do fine.
So you think they will? Because, we kind of had a story from Midland, Texas recently where people were feeling pretty gloomy, to be honest. It didn't feel like a very kind of a vibrant oil patch, if you like. And they're worried about this sort of this is at $60-ish a barrel at the moment, and we think we reported recently that President Trump would like to see that closer to 50, and they're quite scared. So what message would you have for them? They're big supporters of the administration, and now they're hurting.
They are. They've continued to innovate, continue to drive down prices. When you drive down prices as well, of course, you have even faster economic growth and faster demand growth. It's a cyclical business. When you drill an oil well, like building an office building, that asset lasts for a long time. If you build long-lived assets, you're in a cyclical business. And they're seeing that. But it's really a story of efficiency. If you look at the American shale revolution, in less than 20 years, we went from the largest importer of oil in the world, and the largest importer of natural gas in the world, to today by far the world's largest exporter, net exporter of natural gas, and one of the world's largest exporters of oil. And in natural gas, we went from over 1,000 rigs drilling for natural gas when we were the world's largest importer to just over 100 rigs drilling for natural gas today at twice the production, the world's largest exporter. So yeah, think of that transition. Explosion in production, but we went from running over 1,000 drilling rigs to 120 for natural gas. So the oil and gas industry has been a victim of its own success, its own efficiency. And it has made it a tough business. The returns on capital in the oil and gas business over the last 20 years have not been great. That's what, if you drive efficiency, you can make business conditions tough, but society as a whole, the world as a whole, benefits massively from that increased supply and that lower cost supply.
So I think the headline on that story from Midland was something like, the last thing anyone here in Midland, Texas wants is cheap Venezuelan oil. And we spoke to a bunch of people and they felt they were hurting, and all of a sudden, this kind of new, kind of untapped resource is going to come online. How do you plan to encourage American oil and gas companies to go into Venezuela, to invest in Venezuela, and to repair the clapped-out infrastructure there?
Oh, no encouragement necessary. No encouragement necessary. I have been inundated with outreach from companies, tons of companies I knew, tons of companies I don't know, tons of American companies. You know, there's drilling companies in Colombia. They're like, we can move rigs over right away. There's international companies. We'll send things over. Everybody's saying, how can we get in to assess the opportunities? How can we bring capital? Hey, we've identified these projects we wanted to work on 20 years ago. We're ready to go now. What does it take? The limiter right now has just been our OFAC, approval through our Treasury Department to be clear on rule of law and corruption practices to enable businesses to go in. But the interest to go into Venezuela has been simply tremendous. And Venezuela, of course, started as a geopolitical thing. When I was born, Venezuela was the third biggest oil producer. It was the United States, the Soviet Union, and Venezuela. A very wealthy, vibrant democracy that was a longtime U.S. ally, 25-year descent, in a 70% decline in the real GDP, one of the greatest collapses in history. But that has exported drugs, guns, crime, kidnapping to its neighbors and into the United States. That's the United States' primary interest. Venezuela has a growing problem in our hemisphere. Hezbollah has their Western Hemisphere headquarters in Venezuela. Iran, Cuba, Russia, these are not the U.S.'s best friends, have this beachhead in Venezuela. So, and of course, President Biden put a $25 million bounty on the head of Maduro because of his drug running and criminality. So a brilliant military operation removes the top two heads of that thing. And what we're trying to do is, without boots on the ground, without bullets being fired, alter the trajectory of Venezuela to the benefit of the United States, to the benefit of the hemisphere, and massively to the benefit of the Venezuelan people. And yes, that will absolutely bring more oil onto the marketplace. Global consumers as a whole will win, and it will put additional competitive pressure on the producers of oil and gas in the United States. But U.S. is by far the biggest oil producer. In fact, if you look at total oil, we produce more than Russia and Saudi Arabia combined. Those companies in Midland, Texas, got there by innovation. When oil was $80 down from $110, shale economics were deeply challenged. And what did they do? They just kept innovating as that price went down. So yes, it's tough times, but they'll innovate, they'll thrive.
So all of this incoming interest you've had for people chomping at the bit to get into Venezuela, they obviously don't ascribe to this point of view expressed by the Exxon chief executive that it is quote-unquote uninvestable.
Well, look at that decline over 25 years and the collapse of the rule of law. I think what Darren Wood said there was pretty obvious. The question is, how is that going to move going forward? But oil and gas companies go into countries all around the world in all different situations. So is a major like Exxon going to dive in next week? No. Are small entrepreneurs or mid-sized entrepreneurs going to go in next week? Yes. Are the incumbent players like Chevron, like Repsol, like E&I, are they going to grow and expand their operations? Yes. Might Exxon eventually come into Venezuela? Yeah, quite possibly. But they're going to move at a different pace. That's the beauty of business. We've got all different businesses with different risk tolerances, different ways of operating, different ways of doing business. But I have no worries whatsoever about companies and capital going into Venezuela.
And this is without the need to provide sort of guarantees or sort of security guarantees or anything like that. You think that they will come and do it on their own steam, they'll hire their own private security, they don't need American government help.
Correct, correct. Of course, with the United States' control of the export revenues of Venezuela and a very different relationship with the government of Venezuela now, of course, we'll do everything we can for the benefit of Venezuela, the hemisphere, and America to have it easier and safer to do business in Venezuela. So that, I think that you will see a very positive trajectory in the coming months on that front.
Now, some of the people we talk to that are slightly more wary of going in, they're worried a little bit about the kind of sort of whether the changes to the regime have gone far enough, whether Delcy Rodriguez will really be a kind of friend of America in the long term, and worried about a change of administration in the future, and have going in, spending all the money, and having to sort of go back out again, sort of yo-yo type action. So how can you kind of like convince them that kind of they can get in there and stay for the long haul?
Well, again, I'm not in the business of convincing anyone or securing anyone. I'm a big believer of capitalism.
Yeah.
So this is a very innovative foreign policy thing President Trump led here. And so this has never been done before. So we're going to see how that goes. But people that are going to go in right now are certainly not going to go in with I'm going to build all this infrastructure and it's going to pay out in the next 10 years. They're going to go in at low-hanging fruit. There's a whole bunch of wells in Venezuela that aren't producing what they could produce. There's short, quick payback things that can be done right away. So there is a different risk level. Of course, it's not like doing business in Midland, Texas right now. But that's the nature of business. It's risk and reward. When the risk is higher, the reward needs to be higher. If they get stability in Venezuela and move, we're 3 weeks in right now. So yeah, do we have a permanent, reestablished pathway for Venezuela? No, way too early for that. We're just trying to stabilize the existing situation, a long road to a representative government, changes of laws and all that. That's going to take months and years. But different businesses will come in at different times for different reasons, different risk profiles, different return profiles. But again, beauty of capitalism.
Sticking with geopolitics, but moving elsewhere, Greenland obviously was the kind of main focus of President Trump's speech yesterday and has indeed been the focus of this meeting in large part. You went there in March, I think, is that right? March of last year. And you said that the sort of way forward was to build partnerships that respect Greenland's self-determination. That seems to be, we think, where we are today, but it wasn't where we were yesterday and it wasn't where we were last week. So can you explain to us just a little bit about the journey that the administration has been on to get here?
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much a journey as a dialogue and negotiation. President Trump, the interest in Greenland, I should also say, unquestioned, can't even find the right word. President Trump's interest in Venezuela is for national security reasons, full stop. That's the interest in Venezuela. He believes in commerce and trade and business as ways to bring peace. You've seen that in the Middle East. He's talked about, oil and gas and minerals in Greenland and all that. That's to say, hey, if you have a tight American partnership, capital will flow in, better jobs and opportunities for Greenlanders will be there. It's not that the U.S. needs another supply of these things. It's never been about economic reasons for the United States. It's been about national security. If you look where Russian assets are, if you look at the military threats, strategic military threats to the United States, Greenland's in the center of the action. So it has been his vision for geopolitics, and it's not a crisis today or tomorrow or next week, but what's the trajectory the world is heading on? That is strategically important. And if the United States is going to invest massive monies into a defense system that would incorporate Greenland to protect the Western Hemisphere and ultimately an expansion of that system to protect Europe as well from strategic missile threats, Greenland is central to that. What's the best avenue to get the United States comfortable to pour massive investments into that? To him, that's if you're going to. This is a many decades long commitment. an obvious and easy way to do that if you have U.S. sovereignty over it. But if there are other mechanisms that can align incentives and all that for long-term investments, he's a businessman. He's open to negotiations. But his goal is the security of the United States, the security of North America, and the security of NATO. That's what drives the thinking.
And I won't ask you to get into what those mechanisms might be and so on, but it is plausible that a mechanism short of kind of territorial kind of control would be kind of amenable to the president and would kind of achieve those stated ambitions.
I'll definitely let the president, lead on the communications and where that's going. But the president is pragmatic. He thinks long-term. He thinks big picture. He's pragmatic at how to get his objectives. Simple statement of his whole policy. Why did he run for re-election again? It's prosperity at home, peace abroad. Everything he does is how do we drive prosperity to the American people and peace abroad. And the biggest way to bring peace abroad is to bring commerce and interchange among nations. The goal in the Middle East, these are mostly thriving, wealthy nations, and some that don't fall in that bucket, but could if they had peace and commerce instead of conflict. Mm-hmm. President Trump is relentless in trying to drive that.
And obviously, you said the kind of primary kind of driver of this Greenland policy is national security. There are rare earths on Greenland too. Are there opportunities for American businesses there?
I would say not of scale. Mm-hmm. Think of, it's 50,000 people, and it's a tougher climate to do business in, physical climate. Rule of law, fine, but it's a tougher physical climate there. I think when President Trump talks about that, it's more what would be additional upside for the residents of Greenland. Yes, American businesses, as we just talked about in Venezuela, they'll go in far-flung places. They'll invest risk capital to develop jobs and opportunity. And if you're in Greenland, economic opportunities are somewhat limited. So this is more his pitch. Hey, if you're very tight, or if you're part of the United States or extremely tight with the United States, there's going to be increased jobs, opportunity, and wages for Greenlanders. But again, they're not going to be of the scale that are going to move the needle for the United States. But peace at home, or prosperity at home, peace abroad is the agenda.
Now, another big theme of the meeting has been AI. Obviously, huge consumers of power. US data centers are on track, I think, to triple their energy consumption by 2028. How much of that new power is going to come from natural gas versus other resources, do you think?
Well, natural gas is by far the largest source of electricity in the United States. Second in the world, coal is by far the biggest global source of electricity. Mm-hmm. It was 100 years ago. It will be when you and I die. So that's just a reality. And so I love coal. I love all sources of energy that are affordable, reliable, and better people's lives. Coal is high on that list. But in the U.S., shale gas, because of these innovations in shale development, just economically outcompeted coal and became our largest source of electricity. So it's quite likely that'll be the largest supply of incremental capacity to power AI. But in the short run, President Trump's actions stopped the closure of 17 gigawatts of coal plants in the United States last year. If President Trump had not won the election, we would have 17 gigawatts today less firm capacity than we had before. To make a huge splash in AI, we need sort of 50 to 100 gigawatts of additional capacity. That's 17. That's 17 right there just by common sense regulatory reactions. In fact, AI has been tremendously helpful for my dialogues across Europe, incredibly constructive dialogues about, hey, the world has changed. Affordable, reliable electricity is key to next generation scientific innovation, to AI and the economic opportunities it brings. What's the best pathway to get there?
Now, these are very interesting. These are effectively orders to coal plants to keep going. Sort of like you couldn't think of anything kind of that put in such sharp relief the difference between yourselves and the UK, which has just shut all of its UK plants. You're actually ordering them, coal plants, you're ordering them to stay open. How does that work? How long does the order last?
So the emergency powers we're using only last for 90 days. They can continue to be re-upped.
And you can just keep doing that, forever.
No. The bigger thing is the messaging to the place. All of these, most all of these coal plants were ordered to close, just like in the UK, for political reasons. It looks good. Our state said we're going to be off coal. They agreed on dates to close the coal plants years ago, and by God, they're going to hold that political promise. Forget the ratepayers, forget the risk of blackouts, forget the closing off of opportunity for new data centers or reshoring of manufacturing in the United States. They were just silly political promises. More than half the time, the utilities are saying, hey, it would be great if you could help us keep this coal plant open. I took a lot of heat for the first one, a 1.5 gigawatt coal plant in southwestern Michigan. We don't need it. It's going to cost the ratepayers. It's no good or whatever. That plant ran at over 60% capacity, above average in the grid. We would have had blackouts in our Midwest last summer and this winter if that plant had not stayed open. So no. In fact, the orders to keep plants open have only been on a few of them. Everyone else got the message. The utilities and ratepayers in the states, hey, we don't actually have to close those plants? Great. So most of them have stayed open, not because of our orders, because they've realized that the federal government, in addition to their state government, is not going to force them to drive up their energy prices and reduce the stability of their grid. We're focused on the consumers in America, the price of electricity, and not on political messaging. And of course, closing a few coal plants in the UK or in the United States does nothing, almost nothing, for global greenhouse gas emissions.
So talking of consumers, electricity costs are going up, I think up 6.7% year on year in December, up a lot since 2020, nearly 40%. How much of that is due to the AI data center build out?
Zero. In fact, what it is, of course, it's adopting UK energy policies in the United States under President Biden and under President Obama before. We've had a tailwind of these things to drive up our own energy prices. And so that's a battleship we're stopping and turning back. Let me give some quick data on that. So fortunately, in the United States, we have this federalist experiment. We have 50 states. About 28 of them have renewable portfolio standards, with state goals and with sometimes laws to enforce them to close coal plants and build more wind and solar. We have 22 states that don't have those. They still build wind and solar if the math works. We have 50% higher electricity prices in the states with renewable portfolio standards than in the states that don't. And if you look at the last 5 years, we've had growth in electricity rates twice the rate of inflation in states that are governed by Democrats with renewable portfolio standards. In the red states governed by Republicans, some of even which have renewable portfolio standards, electricity has risen on average half the rate of inflation. So the real price of electricity has not gone up, but the crazy $5 trillion stimulus spending to fill a $1.5 trillion GDP output gap drove inflation, from the Biden administration. That's driven the price of everything up. But these are fixable problems. If you have expensive energy in your state or in your country, it's because politicians and regulators chose to do that. It is not bad luck. It is not marketplace. Affordable, reliable, secure energy is available for everyone. And so what we're trying to do is reverse those policies in the United States. We have record low gasoline prices already. The changes in the electricity market, those take a little bit longer. But there is no reason to have these rapid increases in electricity prices. No reason. It's politics.
But there has to be something that has to change, surely, because it seems like the president wants tech companies and so on to foot some of the bill themselves to build their own energy capacity. He was talking about it a lot yesterday. They build their own energy capacity, then they give the unused back to the grid and so on. So there's got to be some kind of demand crunch coming. No?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, demand is growing. So we have to build new capacity to serve that demand. But here's another data point backed by numbers, not opinions. If you look at the states with the fastest growth in electricity demand, North Dakota leads the way, 35% growth in electricity demand over the last 5 years. Their prices in nominal terms are down. So look, the most favorable price trajectories have been in the places with the fastest demand growth. If you look at California, Massachusetts, New York, that have followed a more European policy, they produce less electricity today than they did 5 years ago, and significant rise in capacity. If I look at the EU as a whole, over the last 25 years, spent over $1 trillion, it has doubled the stated capacity of its grid and produces 10% less electricity than it did 20 years ago. So it's lack of demand growth and forced retirements and forced expenditures on unreliable sources. That's the source of rising prices. Rising demand is actually a force for downward prices. Because electricity grid, half of the time, or on average, you only use a little over half the stated capacity. And of course, in Europe, it's way lower than that because you've got unreliable sources. But in the US, we have massive spare capacity at all times. But you have to be able to supply demand at peak demand or people die. So if you put on a steadier load like a data center, that's actually a pathway to lower prices. You're going to you have to add new capacity at peak demand time. You have to add new capacity, but you're going to have higher average utilization of that assets, and you're going to have downward forces on prices. And so what President Trump's trying to do is just accelerate the development of these things. American oil and gas production has surged, not electricity production. Why? Different regulatory regimes. We have smothered a European bureaucratic-like overlay on our electricity system. We have to reform that. But in the short term, yes, the hyperscalers that want to build data centers, hey, come in and help us. Let's build plants quickly. Let's build plants in a simpler regulatory environment. You'll get electricity to lead in AI. And in the long run, and the medium term, it'll help drive down electricity prices as well. So it's just bringing some common sense business to the electricity sector.